I actually started teaching, I guess I was about 20 years old when I opened my first school. And I started practicing when I was about 12 years old. And so I realized a few weeks ago that I was coming up on almost 40 years of doing this, and that the school has actually been intact for about 30 years. And back when we were at about 10 years, I thought, wow, you know, it would be interesting. I should probably like try to compile what all we've accumulated in 10 years. And of course, 10 years whooshed right by, and that never happened. And then 20 years came by, and I said, oh, you know, I should really try to capture and encapsulate or somehow do. And then, of course, 20 years rushed right on by. And then now we're coming up with almost 30 years. And I thought this was an appropriate time to actually do it because there are more people teaching now. Things have kind of expanded in a little bit of different directions. We're doing more things now. We're doing more methods than we've done before. If someone was looking from the outside, it might look like there's a lot more pieces going around, and it might be harder to sort of put all those pieces together. So that's one of the reasons I thought it would be good for me to tell the whole story of how those pieces got accumulated and what was the thread or the logic of that story as that happened. You guys know probably that I typically like to speak extemporaneously because it's the most interesting for me because I and no one else knows where we will end up. But that's, I actually specifically am trying to be disciplined, which is why I have my notes, and I'm going to try to tell a very specific story in a specific way, which is not my typical approach, so you'll have to bear with me as I go through it. But I wanted people to be able also to understand some of the depths or the nuances about what they're practicing here and what exactly we're offering, because there's some complicated, subtle things going on that were not obvious to me 30 years ago when we began. And to get to where we are now, there was this process that it's sort of useful to understand. It should help to add some nuance into what you're practicing, to sort of understand that story. There's another aspect to it, and that is that if you look at what we're practicing from the outside, you would call our approach eclectic, meaning we're not just one tradition. In an ideal scenario, in an ideal setting, I would say, well, here's my one single complete lineage, and here was my one teacher that taught it to me, and then here was his teacher, et cetera, back to the founder of the style. But in reality, rarely has that been the case in history, and it's certainly less been the case in recent history as these things have translated from the Far East to the West. A lot of the transitions that have happened as these practices were passed on through history were incomplete transmissions, or they were greatly modified by the new setting. So there's a story there, and these things are always sort of morph as they go. My approach is eclectic, not because I have an attitude about those old fuddy-duddy traditionalists and they do it this way, but I'm this new revolutionary eclectic. Not at all. The reason is because none of those traditional lineages, none of those traditions were ever intact when I got a hold of them. They were always fragmented. There were always pieces that were there and other pieces that were misunderstood, or they were in backwards or upside down. And that's part of the story also. But what that means is that we've been eclectic because we've been trying to get the most and the best and the highest level explanation of what's been going on. When I say these traditions were for the most part fragmented or incomplete, that doesn't mean that the people that were professing them were saying that they were incomplete or that there was something, that wasn't all the way to the root of them. a lot of these situations say, oh yeah, this is an absolutely complete lineage, and ours is the only one, and ours is the true one, and ours the... And when I pursued those, I found that that's usually not the case. I never really found a truly intact tradition that I felt would win me away from eclecticism. My approach was always, I wanted to get exposure to the highest level masters doing whatever they were doing. It didn't matter to me what particular art they were doing if they were acknowledged at a certain standard. That was sort of the meter that I used to determine who to work with. But so I thought this was a good time to have this conversation because it sort of ties all these pieces together, and it's sort of, for example, there are different approaches, and we teach a number of different forms. Some of these different forms have different definitions of what's correct and what's not correct, and then people pass them on a little differently. And we've all, some of you have heard me talk about, for example, if we have Duke Ellington playing the A Train and Count Basie playing the A Train, and a 6-month saxophone student playing the A Train, we're going to have a standard there. And while Count Basie and Duke Ellington's, their version will not be the same. We'll always be able to say, oh yeah, those were somehow correct, and the 6-month saxophone student probably needs a little more work. You know, we might even say, yeah, parts of that were completely wrong. So there's a distinction between stylistic difference and right and wrong. And to understand the martial arts, because there's so many styles, this becomes a complicated topic. So there's a lot of diversity in this practice, and to understand why there is this diversity, we have to talk about fighting, because the core of martial arts is fighting. Fighting has some unique aspects to it. There's a number of them. There's only a couple that are relevant for us tonight. Probably one of the most unique aspects about fighting. You know, people do all sorts of physical activity. People, you know, they're playing ball sports and they're jogging and they're running and they're doing all these things. But what's unique about fighting is that there's absolutely no rules about it whatsoever. Fighting is anything goes. And through history, this has been the case. Anything goes. And there's no definition of right, there's no definition of wrong, there's just who's standing in the end and who's not standing. There's no idea of fair play in fighting. It's all about who's standing in the end and who's not standing in the end. The second aspect about fighting is that if you're playing soccer and you lose, oh, big deal, you lose. Or you play chess and you lose, okay, big deal, you lose. When you're fighting and you lose, the best you can hope for is humiliation. The worst can be really bad, and in history this has been death. So you have people that are extremely motivated, and they're in an area where there are no rules. If you understand this from history, and this is a great, I mean, being as far as we are from Los Alamos, we have a great billion-dollar monument to the fact that throughout history, the highest and best technology, the most resources, the best minds go to developing warfare. That's been the case from the Stone Age, and it is not different now. When Gandhi said that civilization, Western civilization, sounded like a great idea and he thought we should try it, this is probably one of the things that he was pointing to. Because this is not stopped, not changed. All of our best and our brightest and the most expensive all goes to developing the technology of warfare. When I was discussing with one of the masters from Taiwan, I think we were talking about the environmental catastrophes or some sort of thing like that. He said, oh, don't underestimate this country. He was talking about the United States. So what do you mean? He says, this is the country that has dominated the world in warfare. They'll find out how to fix the That's the way he thought about it. That's kind of how significant this was for him, right? That has some interesting implications to it. The fact that there's no rules, and the fact that you're facing humiliation or maiming or death or worse if you don't get it right, creates an extremely interesting context for things to develop. It's very different than soccer. I don't care how much you pay the soccer stars or the NFL stars or the NBA stars. You're in a situation where there's rules and there's committees. You're not going to have this driving force to discover every possible advantage that could ever be discovered. And with all of this impetus and motivation behind it to discover it. So there's a couple of interesting implications of that. And I think that a couple of these things, well, probably the most important one, the most relevant to our discussion, is that, you know, if you're going to practice soccer, what's the best way to get good at soccer? You go out and play soccer, right? Best way to play basketball, go out and play basketball. So now if you want to get good at fighting to the death, there the logic breaks down, right? Say, well, actually the best way is probably just go out there and fight to the death, right? Well, that works for 50% of the population the first time. And then the second time, it works for only 25% of the population, right? And then as we go, we say, well, okay, we can't do that. So what that means is you get this entire field that, remember, is motivated by death and humiliation, a field where anything goes. There's no rules, right? And this whole field is now devoted to basically doing one thing to achieve another different thing. Okay? And this becomes significant. Maybe I'm going to do push-ups and I'm going to jog so I get good endurance so that when I get in the situation where I'm fighting to the death for my life, I'll at least have a little good wind. Okay? That's a reasonable start. But there's a process that's going on here that I would call bridging. Okay? And by bridging, I mean we do this one thing with the idea that it's going to bridge across to this whole other thing that's related somehow, but maybe not that related in other ways. And maybe those ways are critical or important. But still, we'll make an adjustment to try to work with it. And you know, within martial arts, you have this conundrum generating all styles. And literally, there's every kind of style out there. When we undertake this bridging, we make a whole series of assumptions that go along with that bridging. And what I would say is that the way that we do that bridging brings our whole worldview in along with it. Because locked into that bridging is our philosophy, is our understanding of how life works and what effort produces what fruit. So for example, you have what I might call the empirical school that says, not without reason, that we want to train as absolutely realistically as we can without actually going to the death. So we're going to say, okay, no eye poking, and no nose biting, and no groin kicking. Although, and people draw these lines in every different kind of place. But they say we're going to, the more you train for what you're going to do, the better you're going to do it. Well, that's great, except as soon as we throw the clause to the death in there, which was the classical martial arts situation, the whole psychology changes. The whole dynamic changes. There's a famous story of a Zen master in archery. He has a student, and the student says, Master, I think I've got it. Now look, and he shoots the arrow, and he hits the bullseye, and he shoots another arrow, and he splits that arrow, and he shoots another arrow, and he splits that arrow. The master goes, yeah, you're pretty good. Come with me. And he stands him out on the edge of a cliff, 300 feet down, and says, hit that tree. Of course, No, it's still a little more work. You can't hit the tree because the fear of death is right there, so strong. So how can we really prepare for that? It's a big leap. There's a gulf that we have to bridge across. So the empirical model says, okay, we know what it looks like, we know we're going to need some wind, we know we're going to need some strength, we know we're going to need some cagey actions, and we're going to try to piece together something that's going to set us up as well as we can for that. And then you have this other model, and the other model says, well, there's no rules, anything goes. So we're in a realm of all possibilities here. So what are the limits? Well, the only limits are the human capacity. What are the limits of what a human can do? Instead of let's looking at fighting, let's look at what a human can do, since we know we're limited with that as the tool in this situation. So one whole school of thought, the empirical person says, this is what is. The rational person says, this is what must be, according to these other rules that I understand. According to principle, this is what must be. As opposed to the empirical person, no, this is what I see, right? So the one guy's doing jogging, and the one guy's doing push-ups, and it has a very empirical approach to it. A whole other lineage, there's somebody out in the field, they're just standing in one place, they're not doing anything. Well, they don't have the same kind of empirical method. There's something going on in their bridging that explains why they think that's a better use of their time and energy than jogging around the block another time, right? Different schools of thought. So, let's see where I am with my notes here. So one of the things that's interesting about this, we're almost to the point where I'll start telling the actual story. I just want you guys to have these generalizing, contextualizing sort of principles to work with. So you have all these different methods, and some of them are exercises, and some of them are training systems. And one of the things that martial arts has come up with that seem to be unique is this idea of forms. There's people doing, playing baseball for 100 years. Nobody came up with a form that said, if you did this form, this would improve your swing, or this would add something to do. Forms are a pretty unique thing within the martial arts. And forms have this problem of having to bridge to reality. So when you look at a form, there's a question that's always there, and that is, what are the assumptions that are made in how this practice of this form is going to bridge to reality? And your philosophy or your worldview determines that. But also the fact that we're doing this bridging, the fact that we've entered this zone where we're doing one thing to get another result, that another result initially was success in fighting to the death in the streets, right? But now we start getting into this do one thing to get another thing. We start opening up the human potential to do that one thing. We start a sort of a metaphorical process happen, and this happened through history, and that is the reality that we're bridging to no longer is exactly limited to the idea of fighting to the death in the streets. Now this idea of what we're fighting for, this doing one thing to get another thing, now this doing one thing might get us even something else. That idea of fighting for survival to the death in the streets starts to take on a metaphorical perspective, and it starts to take on the life of the challenge or the battle for self-perfection, right? We have this idea that's, you can study painting and you can try to paint perfectly, or you can make yourself perfect and just paint naturally, which is a different angle. You can struggle with the painting, or you can perfect yourself and then just naturally paint. So the idea with martial arts, right, and this is, some people, they're not, they don't understand when they hear that the Buddha was an expert champion martial artist. Because their image of Buddhism and quietism and everything is that if somebody gives you any grief, just fall down on the ground like a vegetable, right? That is a quietist, pacifist, I don't want to fight, Well, if you do the research, the Buddha had some very interesting encounters with some really, really nasty characters. And he came out okay. And he came out okay, not just because he was the Buddha, but he was also a very highly skilled martial artist before he went into it all. If you're interested in that, there's a traditional story where the Buddha meets a character named Angulimala. You know mala beads that they wear in India? Well, Anguli means fingers. And this character, his mala beads were made of human fingers of all the characters that he had killed. And this was part of his puja for this particular tradition, which was kind of a macabre tradition in India. And the Buddha sees this through his divine vision and goes and has an encounter with Angulimala. And when he goes into the woods, where Angulimala has been bothering everybody, his disciples are like, "What are you doing? Where are you going in there?" And they won't go in. And they decide they'll meet him on the other side of the forest at the town where he's going to. And the Buddha goes into the forest alone. And the way the story is told is Angulimala keeps trying to catch him. And the way the sutras say it, they say that he didn't move fast, but he was always too far away from Angulimala to catch. So I thought, this is very interesting. He sounds like he's very good at controlling distance and space. It seems like to me. Until finally Angulimala is so frustrated with him, he tries to catch him, he can't catch him, he finally shouts at him, "Stop!" And that's when the Buddha stops and he looks and he says, "No, you stop." Right? Till finally he finishes, they get to the other side of the forest, he meets all the disciples again, and he's got a new disciple with him. He said, "Oh, you got a new disciple? Who's he?" "Oh, this is my new disciple, Angulimala." They all get up and run away. And they go, "Oh, no, he's changed now. He changed his program." Right? But there's a number of stories about the Buddha being an expert martial artist. And in fact, our picture up here in the corner of Bodhidharma is because Bodhidharma is considered the father of Shaolin boxing. So there's a little something more complicated than just a pure non-violence. There's something going on in the pursuit of self-perfection. And the idea that this struggle against the doing the one practice to achieve this other thing, that doesn't just have to be to achieve survival in the knockdown, drag-out scenario in the street, but it also has to do with all obstruction, all things that stand in the way of self-perfection, all things that keep the human from operating at the optimal level. That, whether you're fighting perfectly or you're painting perfectly, if you make yourself perfect, you got all the bases covered. You're just worrying about painting perfectly, you still got all the other things to worry about, right? So there's this idea within Buddhism that we use these things as a path to some other place, and they call that path a Do. And so when the Shaolin got translated, Bodhidharma is not just considered the father of Shaolin boxing, he's also considered the father of Soto Zen Buddhism. So there's a very interesting linkage there that's old. Okay, so that all is a prelude to the specific story of how the pieces here got accumulated. Are we good there? Does that all make sense? It's kind of a unique situation. So when I started, I was 12 years old, and I had an image that was made from the media that was largely romantic image of the Oriental master who had all sorts of unfathomable knowledge and inexplicable abilities and superhero-like qualities, and some higher dharma informing his actions and things like that. And but in the 70s, this was the early 70s, and there were martial arts in America seriously maybe 20, 25 years. America had been in Japan in World War II, and there were service people, and it was largely through that things started showing up in the United States. So the first models of things that we got were Japanese, typically. Judo, karate. What I came across was called Taekwondo. And Taekwondo is a curious construction that had a lot to do with the intermingling of Japanese and Korean cultures during the Japanese occupation of Korea, which they occupied them for about 36 years. A fun fact which the Koreans do not smile upon, because it was some brutal times. But the original Taekwondo was informed by General Che of the ITF, and he led Korean Taekwondo for about 10 years. The original Taekwondo was heavily influenced by Japanese Shotokan karate, because General Che was a black belt in Japanese Shotokan karate. So the first forms that anybody did in the Taekwondo system were the exact same forms that Shotokan uses. And they were called the Pyogan forms. And the style of movement, to understand the style of movement that went on in Japanese karate, you need a little backstory. Japanese karate is not an ancient art. Japanese karate showed up in Japan in 1922. And the founder was Gishin Funakoshi, who brought it from Okinawa. The Okinawans learned what became known as Okinawa Te, or Okinawan hands, from the southern Chinese in Fujian province, China. They were engaged in a political issue with the Japanese, and they needed martial arts for martial arts purposes. They needed to fight. They were fighting people that had armor and weapons. And so Okinawa Te was focused a lot on one strike kills. Because you're attacking somebody who's dressed in armor with a big sword, and you're only going to get one shot. So the Okinawa Te translated to Japan, made some changes, and Gishin Funakoshi created this style, Shotokan. General Che was exposed to Shotokan, became a black belt in Shotokan karate, so he used all those same forms, but he brought in some of the Korean kicking movements. There were some Korean indigenous styles, Kuksul, the Hapkido tradition, which is still doing pretty well, Taekyun. There were some indigenous kicking arts that definitely had components that were not like the Japanese styles. But what you basically had then was a Korean copy of a Japanese copy of an Okinawan copy of a Fujian Shaolin style. Okay? Whenever you see a school that says Kempo, what Kempo means is Kempo is the Japanese word for two Chinese characters, kanji characters, that mean chuan fa. Fa means method, chuan means to roll up your fist, to roll up your fingers, to make a fist, therefore boxing. So basically Kempo means boxing methods. But it's Chinese boxing methods in Japanese. So that tells you that these methods were taken originally from China. So basically I began practicing with Duk Sung Sun, well, not with Sun, but with a black belt under his lineage. And I got as far as a month away from my brown belt test. Now it's interesting the way this style worked. The early Taekwondo style, you practiced forms. You practiced what the Japanese would call kizo kumite, or sometimes they refer to now as one or three step sparring. Are you familiar with that term?
Not sure.
Okay. And what these are again, this is this idea somehow we're going to bridge. We're going to take methods and we're going to try to prescribe the movement a little bit, but we're going to try to tell ourselves that by doing this, when we're out in the street and anything goes, somehow we're going to be able to bridge from that anything goes scenario to this preconceived thing that we practice. And you had also kumite, what they called kumite, which is free sparring. In that school, the free sparring was done very rarely. I think I had practiced, 2+ years to get to brown belt. I had fought with a black belt once, and it was very formalized, very stylized. There was no question what was going to happen. There was no real, it wasn't what I came later to understand as real fighting. And it was absolutely no contact, which means that you'd throw a punch to the opponent's nose and you'd stop 2 or 3 inches away. So I got to brown belt, and I was, you know, like an assistant instructor at brown belt, and then a new school came to my town. Now, I was sure that my school was better, but I still wanted to go and see because I was a little bit, you know, karate crazy, kung fu crazy in those days. So any kind of new school, any kind of different style, I wanted to check it out. So I went there, there was this, the teacher there had 6 students, and he was a 4th dan black belt. I had never even seen a 4th dan black belt before. But he also was a Green Beret, 2 years combat in Vietnam with the Air Force, and had done a lot of extensive competition fighting. He was 2 years a boxing champion in the U.S. Air Force in Europe. And I came and checked out his school, and which was a ratty little place, maybe not even as big as this, and with a broken wooden floor that you'd have to be very careful where you stepped as you were running away from these people. And so I went there, and Peter showed me films of him winning a championship. I don't think he showed me Cho at that time, but basically he said, okay, well, come on out on the floor, we're going to fight. We're going to fight? Like, I was a week away from my brown belt test, and he was a 4th dan black belt. Like, okay, he's like, yeah. So we fight, and basically he demonstrates to me quite effectively that I can't hit him at all, no matter how bad I want to, and I can't get away from him at all. He doesn't throw a kick or a punch. He uses too close, too far away, make sure that I'm always missing, and then he comes in with his hands behind his back, bumping into me, showing me basically that I had nothing. And then he says, oh, here's a bag. Do you know how to use a bag? I had never seen a bag because we're doing no contact. What do you need a bag for if you're doing no contact? So then he shows me, and I could snap that kick right out to this far from the bag, you know. And he told me, he said, you're like a knife fight, you're like a knife thrower in the circus. And so long you practice missing that now you couldn't hit if you wanted to, you know. So then I say, well, by this time he had me quite convinced. And I had known, I had a voice in my head that said that these robotic actions, as optimistic as they are, you know, this was